This is going to be a very brief section of notes on the distributive property. So we already went through several properties of multiplication, but technically, since we called that section of notes properties of multiplication, we can't include the distributive property because the distributive property is actually a property that involves both multiplication and addition, or it could be subtraction. So we can say that the distributive property states that for any numbers a, b, and c, that a times, in parentheses, b plus c is the same thing as a times b plus a times c. Or you've probably seen this as kind of show these lines to show that you're multiplying by everything inside the parentheses. One thing to note here is note that there is addition inside the parentheses. That could also technically be subtraction because we can think of subtraction as addition of a negative. So it doesn't have to be a plus sign. Also, even though we would typically write it with whatever we're multiplying by out front, it could also be the same thing as, say, b plus c times a, right? You might think of that as ba times ca, but that's really the same thing as ab times ac, right? So we can write it with the number behind it as well that we're multiplying by, and it's technically the same thing. You do want to be careful, though, that when you see something like, for instance, this is something we might have seen before when we were doing the associative property, and we might say, for instance, we could change where the parentheses go on that expression. But be careful that you don't think that this is distribution, right? So if it's all multiplication or if it's all addition, we would not use the distributive property, right? So we would not do a times b times a times c. That would not be correct. So this only works if you've got multiplication, but then also addition or subtraction. And then let's look at some examples. So let's suppose we have 2 times in parentheses 5 plus 6. The distributive property says we could distribute that 2 times every term that I'm adding inside the parentheses. So this would be the same thing as 2 times 5 plus 2 times 6. And so let's just prove that that works. So if I were going to work through the left side of this equation without using the distributive property, I would actually follow order of operations and I would do what's inside the parentheses first. So I would do 5 plus 6 and get 11. And then I would then multiply by 2. So 2 times 11 is 22. Versus if I actually use the distributive property and multiply both of these by 2, now I've got 2 times 5, which is 10, and 2 times 6, which is 12. Well, if I add those together, I get 22. So this just proves, at least for this example, but this would work for technically any numbers, that these two things are equal no matter how you go about calculating those. So we could show that there, and then what we would typically see, though, with distributive property problems is often we'll see a variable in there. So let's say, for example, that I had 3 minus x, and that's in parentheses, and then multiply that by 8. So this one, I can't really do what's inside parentheses. I can't simplify that because one of those terms is a variable and the other is not. But I could simplify this by using the distributive property and multiplying both of these by 8. So then I would have 3 times 8, and then negative x times 8. And so this would be 24 minus 8x would be the simplified version using the distributive property.